Good morning, and thank you for joining me for today's midweek reflection from Holy Saviour Church. This week we are in the week of prayer for Christian unity, something which started over 100 years ago. And we're also, in terms of the Church's calendar, still in the season of Epiphany, which begins, of course, with the visit of the Magi to the newly born Christ child. And the Magi were outsiders to the Jewish world. So we're reminded how often we need the stranger. We need the person who's different to us to see things a bit more clearly, to understand the truth a little bit better. I'm now in my 50s, and I'm really sorry to say that I truly and genuinely can't remember a time when this world of ours was more bitterly divided, more greatly polarised than it is now. Our social media age means that people get into disagreements and they get into arguments very easily without any great thought. And people also tend to be reactive to what they see and what they hear, rather than being responsive. And there is a difference between those two things. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has talked about developing the virtue of good disagreement. And I think he's definitely onto something there. It's interesting that when we look at the Bible, we see there were often disagreements within the household of faith right from the very start. For example, Peter and Paul were at loggerheads over whether or not the church's mission should include Gentiles as well as Jews. There's never really been a time when unity meant unanimity. And yet, even in our bitterly divided world, wouldn't it be really good to think that the church could come up with a message of hope for the sake of the world? When we look at our political discourse over recent years, we see how much it has hardened and coarsened. Think, for example, of all of the deep antagonisms in Britain in the wake of the Brexit debate. And globally, during these last 2 or 3 years, we've seen both in the United States and in Brazil, politicians actually encourage their supporters to riot and to storm the very institutions of democracy itself. In the midst of all of this, perhaps what the Christian Church can give, in spite of its own inherent weaknesses and divisions, is to commend the value and the power of good disagreement. So in this week of prayer for Christian unity, perhaps we might all pray that we can learn a bit better how to disagree well. And we perhaps might take comfort too from the words of St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, when he asks that his followers do not pass judgment on each other. And he says this, he says, "Let all be convinced in their own minds, but do not judge one another, and do not make one another stumble." I think that advice is just as relevant now in our own times as it was when he said it. Our hymn for today, the Church's one foundation. And may God's peace go with you.